In the last session, I indicated that news values can guide the production of journalism. News values can be used to build a career in journalism. News values can be used to get employment. News values can be used to write and sell freelance journalism. News values can be used to evaluate the difference, to analyze journalism, to evaluate the difference between ethical, responsible journalism and unethical, irresponsible journalism. To help make the distinction about news values, I looked at 4 basic factors. First, the need to pay for the production of journalism. Journalism needs paid journalists and paid editors. Second, the role of the audience in generating revenue for journalism. Third, one extreme of journalism that is motivated by profit and will sell information that is misleading and untrue and biased to make a profit. And fourth, the other extreme of journalism that produces information that is independent and true, even if it produces less revenue to do that. So we could define good journalism as journalism that is ethical, truthful, and serves the good of society, to have information from a source that is independent of pressure to distort information or make information misleading. If we limit news values to ethical, truthful, responsible journalism, we would say that those specific news values guide the production of journalism for the good of society. So in a minute, I'm going to get into a list of specific news values and make an effort to define and explain those specific news values. But first, I want to explain how I'm going to divide news values into primary and secondary news values. Primary and secondary news values for ethical, responsible journalism for the good of society. Note that these news values have a Western cultural context, a context in a capitalist and democratic ideology. That does not mean that capitalism and a capitalist and democratic ideology is the only ideology, and it doesn't mean that we're making a value judgment that a capitalist and democratic ideology is better than other ideologies. But we want to understand the cultural context of the news values that we're examining. Now, this idea of ideology is one area where media theorist Noam Chomsky sees journalism working within the context of this ideology of capitalism and democracy to support and reinforce it. But a discussion on that, a discussion on Chomsky and his media theories, that discussion will be better in our media theory course, which I've taught, and that's a different course, and it's not going to be the focus of this course, but I want to acknowledge that that exists. So what do I mean by primary and secondary news values? By primary, I mean news values that should always appear in responsible journalism. By secondary news values, I mean news values that make journalism more interesting and more readable, but are not a justification alone for responsible journalism. So a combination of these primary and secondary news values would be good, But secondary news values without primary news values are questionable, although we will see them in certain branches of the media. Ethical journalism is another category for later in this course, and we have a separate course which I teach in media law and ethics. Ethical journalism basically means truthful, independent journalism without a political agenda, without political censorship. And this journalism also considers minority interests in society. And this is a journalism ideally that tries to minimize the harm that truthful revelations can create. I will deal with ethics later in this course, but they work together with news values and an important part of news values. News values work together in different combinations, so I'm going to talk about the combinations as well. News values are a shared understanding and a shared terminology within the professional media. These terms, the news values, form a basis for reporters and editors to work together and to communicate, to make decisions on the production of news. So news values are terminology for journalists to communicate with each other. It's not, a journalist typically doesn't address the audience in a news story and say, this story is about this news value. It's something that happens behind the scenes, but plays an important role in shaping the news. And because it's a means of communication, you understand that as a journalist. So as a journalist, you might not bring a story idea to an editor who supervises you if you anticipate that the editor will reject the idea for not being hard news. You might anticipate the estimation of you that the editor will make. You might anticipate that the editor will lower his or her estimation of you if you just continue to bring the editor soft news. So the news values are a shared criteria in the background of journalism, not foregrounded in stories, to make decisions and to be self-directing when you're out of touch with the editor. So for example, in my career, working career as a journalist, at one time I was assigned the court beat, and out of all the court cases I could cover, I would cover the courses in priority of their newsworthiness. And I would devote and allocate the time and length of every story, to every court story, to their newsworthiness. And remember, as a court reporter, you're working out of touch with the newsroom for a period of time. You're expected to make decisions, and you're expected to make the right decisions. So by making good decisions based on the relative newsworthiness of court cases when out of touch with the editor, as a reporter I could be more independent of the editor. And when you're reading the biography of Marie Colvin in this course, notice how much Marie Colvin prizes her independence from her editors, and the editor's frustrations with that at times. That is, being a foreign correspondent means that Marie Colvin is out of the country and has a degree of independence that reporters who are every day in the newsroom might not have. If you want to freelance stories, you will have to predict which stories a publication will want to buy, and stories with news values are more likely to be bought, even if they are soft news or feature stories. That is, if you got an idea for a soft news story or featured news story, if you can find an element of news value in that feature story, that will increase your chances of selling the story as freelancer. Now, I'll give you an example of how this works. A couple of years ago in this course, I offered a student the option of a story idea to ride the Greyhound bus from Kamloops on Halloween night in a Halloween costume. And because I realized the potential to publish this story, only one student could do the story. I surveyed the class and I said, here's the story idea. Who'd like to do this? And only one student in the class was interested in that challenge. But this was a hard news story. Riding a Greyhound bus on Halloween night in a costume is not a hard news story. It's a soft news story. It's a feature story. What made this story hard news was that this was the moment when the Greyhound bus terminal was closing forever in Kamloops. And it was a BC story. A Greyhound bus was cutting back its service because of lack of revenue in British Columbia. And this was the local Kamloops angle on this provincial story. So this is a moment in time when the last bus would leave from the Greyhound terminal, and it would mean an end of service, and an end of service that was important for some of the population. Now, in advance, when I saw the date, October 31st, I realized it coincided with Halloween. So, the news angle, the hard news angle, was the end, the last Greyhound bus out of Kamloops, and the end of a transportation service for the community. I contacted the editor of Kamloops This Week in advance because I saw it was something you could schedule in advance. I asked if he would like the story from a student. He said yes, so we knew in advance it would likely be a publication. It was a news feature story. The catch was, and why maybe there were nobody else in the class wanted to do this story, was the student had to produce the story under a tight deadline. Now, she had to finish the story in 2 days, and that's a kind of deadline writing to fit in with the publication dates of Kamloops This Week, and realizing that this story is going to date quickly. That is, a week later, its value has declined because of the news value, I'll get to later, of timeliness. So, more pressure on the student. But she accepted the challenge, and I helped her edit the story. I acted as her editor over the weekend, went back and forth with her, and showed her how to reshape the story so that there'd be virtually no editing needed from Kamloops This Week, which of course is a big advantage to them. In the end, the story was published, and a student who was taking her first journalism course, who'd never published journalism before, got 3/4 of a page in a newspaper, and she got a story for her professional clipping file, news values. But this also allowed me to demonstrate to the class that, in a sense, how easy it is to publish journalism. How easy it is if you have the right angle, the right story, and you have access to it. And so that's what happened in this case. It was a newsworthy story, and so a rookie journalism student in her first weeks of our first journalism class is getting published, and that goes into our clipping file. It sets an example to the class. Now, one more relevant concept to news values is the idea of the good of society. So, to explain that, society is basically an organization of a large group of people for the harmony and benefit of all. For that organization to function, individuals need a sense of duty and obligation to suffer the risks and endure hardship for the good of society. This is what is known politically with the concept of a social contract. We never signed a social contract ourselves, but we understand the concept that belonging to a society involves duties and obligations. Thus, soldiers and police officers feel a sense of duty and obligation to risk their personal safety to protect society. No amount of pay can compensate for that risk. Right now, we observe during the COVID pandemic, medical staff feel a sense of duty and obligation to risk their own health to save others from harm. No amount of pay can compensate those medical staff for those risks. And so when we turn to a journalist like Marie Colvin, we see that she has a sense of duty and obligation to society to reveal secrets that expose suffering and exert pressure to put an end to that suffering. Colvin is not a thrill seeker. In the biography, you'll see that because of her exposure to conflict zones, she suffers from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. No amount of pay can compensate for the risks that Marie Colvin takes and the suffering that she endures personally that amounts to trauma. But there is something that motivates her, and that's one of the interesting things about the biography. Right now I'm talking about the motivation in a society of a sense of duty and obligation for the good of society as part of the social contract. Another example of the idea of what's good for society as a whole is taxing the population. So we tax the population to pay for things that individuals might not need, such as giving the needy welfare or giving the unemployed money while they're unemployed, or to fund schools. Not everybody is a parent, not everybody has children who need to go to school, or not everybody has, the children may be grown up, so technically why do they need to fund schools when their children are grown up? Typically we don't think like that because we understand that taxation is a way to serve the good of society as a whole, and of course we want to pay attention to how tax money is used for the good of all and not to serve as a certain segment of the population. So taxes are a kind of willing sacrifice for the good of society and the good of strangers, people we don't know. Some countries spend tax money to support other countries in the world suffering some kind of hardship. They see their sense of duty and obligation extends beyond their borders. So as a society, we accept risk and sacrifice out of a sense of duty and responsibility for the good of society. Society is also organized by systems. For example, the justice system. The laws in Canada are part of a justice system for the good of society as a whole. If the justice system has flaws, those flaws may not affect us personally, but for the good of society, we accept that the flaws of the system, the justice system, should be fixed, even if fixing them involves more sacrifice. So, for example, if people who are wealthy could pay a judge to find them not guilty, then we would say that is a flaw in the justice system, and we would want that flaw fixed, even though we may not be anticipating going to court. We understand that for the good of society as a whole, the justice system should be operating properly, and the justice system is operating properly if it treats everybody equally and the judgments are fair. So now we have a fuller context for specific news values. News values is not any type of information, but a specific type of information. So when you say that is news to me, you're using a different definition of news than we're going to use in a moment. You are using the word news to mean any kind of information, and that's a popular use of the word news, but it's not how we're going to use the word news professionally. We're going to find news in this course under specific categories operating for the good of society. So now we get to a list that I've compiled of 9 news values, and they correspond with your readings in this course, the text and additional readings. And like I explained, what I've done is I've studied a range of journalism texts and tried to compile and understand what are the most appropriate news values. So I come up with a list of 9, which you see reflected in the text. And I'm just going to list these 9, and then I'm going to go in each one and explain them. So first, impact. Second, magnitude. Third, proximity. Fourth, timeliness. Fifth, equality, justice, and fairness. That's the first 5, and that list is primary news values, which I've explained. Primary in that a story, responsible journalism should have these news values for us to justify it as responsible journalism. Now, secondary news values. I have 4 more on this list, and remember that that I said that secondary news values can support primary news values, but they should not be present alone without primary news values in good journalism. So for secondary news values, I would list 4: conflict, prominence, emotional effect, and oddity or singularity. I'm going to go through that list now very quickly and explain very, very quickly each of these, and then I'm going to take more time in each one and go into the more detail. So in the order that I gave you, starting with the first 5 primary news values, impact, that's the size of the event. Magnitude, that's the number of people affected and other factors of magnitude. Proximity is the closeness of the event to the specific audience. Equality, fairness, and justice are universal human values for the well-being and stability of society. Now getting into secondary, conflict. By conflict, I mean meaningful conflict, not trivial conflict. Conflict that's dependent on the primary news value of impact, or a clash of power and interests, or certain dilemmas. 7, prominence. Prominence is a value for what affects people of influence in society. 8, emotional effect or affinity with audience, and by this I mean meaningful emotional effect, not trivial emotional effect, and we want to tie it back to impact. And the last and 9th, oddity or singularity. That is, the event is interesting because of its rarity or contradiction. Now, if you compare that list to the text in this course, you'll see the text has 8 of these 9. And in the text in chapter 1, it has impact, magnitude, conflict, timeliness, proximity, prominence, oddity, and emotional effect. The explanation is longer in another text, another related text, because it shares an author, and that's a writing text called Reaching Audiences. I've given you an excerpt on Moodle of the section from Reaching Audiences on news values, and that excerpt gives 8 of the 9 news values I've listed. That excerpt has prominence, timeliness, proximity, impact, magnitude, conflict, oddity, and emotional impact. What that text adds is a reminder to think in terms of the audience, and I've already indicated how the relationship between the audience and news values, and that is explored, and that's part of the concept of proximity, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So that order was also sequential, and the sequence indicates some priority and some importance. So the first term was impact, and sometimes magnitude is defined separately from impact, and sometimes it is included with impact. So depending on the text you're reading, you might be reading one text that has the criteria that combine impact and magnitude, and another text separates them, and by separating these two concepts we can be more precise. Impact as a news value means the degree of serious and palpable harm or benefit of an effect on human beings. So you notice the terminology here, the degree, serious and palpable, harm or benefit, effect on human beings. Notice the terminology harm or benefit. That is basically a bad impact or a good impact. And so that impact includes good impacts. We're not just into negative news. We can have positive news values, things that are benefits. So what do we mean by serious and palpable impacts? Well, very quickly, serious and palpable impact would be anything that deals with the preservation of life. So, threats to health, violence, crime, natural disasters, all those have to do with the preservation of life of human beings. And of course, the impact of the COVID pandemic is high in news values, high in impact, and it fits this category of the preservation of life, a serious threat to the health of human beings. So a death COVID and COVID statistics is a negative impact. Getting the vaccination is a positive impact. As well, in trying to explain what we mean by serious and palpable impact, we could talk about the preservation of important elements in the quality of life. And so when we think about important elements in the quality of life, we might think about employment, medical services, and education. So we're starting to get a more precise definition of impact and degree. So take an example. A murder has a high degree of harm on the life of a human being. So that is a high impact. But damage to a car by itself without any human being inside does not harm the life of a human being. So we would say damage to a car, to an object, has less news value. Or example of COVID vaccination. COVID vaccination has a high degree of benefit to the life of human beings. So we want to think more about what kind of information has serious and palpable effects on human beings and what kind of information does not have serious and palpable effect on human beings. Well, one type of story that does not have serious and palpable effect are stories about celebrities or stories about sports. For example, the singer Dolly Parton has just turned 75 years old. Woohoo for Dolly Parton, okay? The actor Alec Baldwin has canceled his Twitter account because of the public backlash against his wife pretending to be Spanish. This is typically and popularly called celebrity news, but you can see how, in terms of a professional, responsible definition of news, it is not news. Calling it news makes it seem more important than it is. It is trivia. But it would make an odd audience uncomfortable to say, listen to this trivia. It seems calling it news makes it sound more important to the audience than it really is. It gives it more dignity. And so if you ask actually somebody, are you interested in trivia or things that are important to life, probably somebody is not going to want to confess they're more interested in trivia. They're more interested in following the story of Alec Baldwin. The fact that Dolly Parton has turned 75 is good for Dolly Parton, but it has no effect on the lives of other people. And the fact that Alec Baldwin has canceled his Twitter account has no effect on other people. But we do realize that kind of information interests an audience, trivia interests an audience, and trivia produces revenue. Well, you can say, but isn't information about celebrities and non-news and trivia, isn't it just harmless? If people want to read trivia, let them read trivia. Why care if people are absorbing harmless information instead of news? Well, one answer to that, to this kind of mindless information, is to consider it as a diversion and distraction from more important issues. Mindless information can be used to distract a population from what has a real effect on their lives. And sometimes we call that concept bread and circuses. The phrase bread and circuses is attributed to the ancient Roman writer Juvenal. And the idea is that you distract the population from being discontent and attacking those in power by giving them free bread, free wheat to fill their bellies, and circuses like games or the gladiatorial combats at the Roman Colosseum to entertain them. The idea is the citizens will be less inclined to rebel if their bellies are full and they are distracted. So soft news may benefit government and corporations by shifting attention from serious matters to trivial, innocuous issues and entertainment. The citizens won't complain if their bellies are full and they are watching gladiatorial combat or they're watching sports or soap operas. And so you'll find this is a distinction to explain in more depth news values in responsible journalism and how that can guide responsible journalism. So I've talked about impact, I've talked about magnitude, and later I can spend more time amplifying these things. So impact is the degree of intensity of an effect on human beings. Magnitude is the number of people affected over a set piece of time. So, for example, the number of deaths of human beings today because of the COVID pandemic is a high impact event, because death is a big serious event, and is a high magnitude event because of the number of people impacted. So you can see this is part of the combination of impact and magnitude and how they can work together. With these two factors, impact and magnitude, we have four basic situations. We can have an event that is high impact with low magnitude. We can have an event that is high magnitude with low impact. We can have an event that is high impact with high magnitude, or we can have an event with low impact and low magnitude. Now, I understand that that sounds formulaic, and we don't want to get overly formulaic in journalism, but having these terms helps to calibrate the way we make decisions, and it makes it easier for us to communicate and argue for one story over another story. So I don't mean it to sound formulaic, and it's not as simple in the field of journalism as having a chart of news values and filling out the chart. But you can see how how these terms and how they interact can give you clarity and help you make a decision. So proximity. And proximity involves us with audience. So let's add the third factor of proximity to impact and magnitude. So proximity is closeness of the audience, a sense of connection, a kind of kinship, and starts with a sense of being close by physical contact. The idea is, in a simple formula, the closer to the audience, the more the impact. The farther from the audience, the less impact. So go back to my example of the news feature story on the last Greyhound bus out of Kamloops. In terms of proximity, that story has high proximity for an audience in Kamloops. For an audience in Halifax, it has low proximity. It's just probably not going to make it into the media in in Halifax. The only way it might make its way into the audience in Halifax is a secondary news value of oddity. That is, this is happening on Halloween. Now, the sense of proximity depends on technology and transportation, and so proximity changes with technology and transportation. Think of if you live in a small village and you can only travel on foot, that level of technology and transportation defines the limit of your proximity. You are you're just basically going to calculate how far you want to walk to get something, to get food, to interact with people, to do trading. If you have a horse, that's an increase in technology and transportation. You can travel farther from the village, and proximity is redefined. When you add new technology like the car, the train, and airplane, they all change the sense of proximity. And so, for example, now we run into things that seem, a bit contradictory. So you can fly to Taiwan from Kamloops faster than you can drive from Kamloops to Toronto. Even though Toronto is physically closer, the technology of air flight, in another sense, makes us closer to Taiwan for a segment of the population. So, technology and transportation allow for the organization of larger societies, and they change our sense of connection and kinship. And now we're going through a really interesting phase in a change in technology and transportation with the internet. And so now, because of the technology, some of my students are in Kuwait and Sri Lanka and South Korea and Colombia, and because of the technology, because of teleconferencing, it doesn't feel like a student in Colombia is that much farther away than a student in Kamloops. The technology and the transportation change things, and now we're actually seeing technology substitute for transportation. Why do we need to fly to a meeting in Singapore if we can do it through teleconferencing? But proximity does define our sense of group. So now we've got three news values: impact, magnitude, and proximity. And we can have now we've got more permutations. We can have close proximity, high impact, and high magnitude, or close proximity, high magnitude, and low impact, and so on and so on. So with three factors, we have 9 permutations of this. Now, proximity can be a strong factor for tabloid journalism and conservative politicians. Proximity is a value that basically plays to the home audience, or how you define the home audience. So the home audience could be the home country. So ex-U.S. President Donald Trump, today, January 20th, Biden is being inaugurated, and Donald Trump is being de-inaugurated. And Donald Trump played to the home audience. So with terms like America first. America first. He's playing to the proximity, the sense of kinship and what's good for American society. And of course, he's out of touch with reality now because the economy is global and citizens are global, and we have a duty and responsibility as responsible citizens to a global world, and not just a narrowly defined proximity. And of course, that's exactly what we see in a Marie Colvin, in the career of Marie Colvin. So that gets me to the fourth news value I talked about, justice. And we add it to the other three as a fourth factor. So now, in terms of permutations, we have 16 permutations of news values. And like I said, I don't mean to suggest an overly abstract kind of mathematical computation for news values. I'm using this to try and get some clarity in how we would guide our decisions and how we would evaluate journalism. So I'm identifying equality, justice, and fairness as an important news value, and I would suggest that this news value can sometimes transcend impact, magnitude, and proximity. I would say that equality, justice, and fairness are part of the social contract, part of the duty and responsibility to the good of society as a whole. So as a society, as a good society, we want to support the necessities of life for everyone, including minorities. And we would believe that we have responsibility as a human being to other human beings, to all human beings. We don't just see ourselves as individual, but as public and social beings, as part of a larger whole, and we feel responsibilities to that larger whole of which we are a part. So, as earlier I brought in to the concept of impact the necessities of life. And we can find those necessities of life defined in the constitutions of countries. The Constitution represents the primary value in a country, legal rights of all citizens, or we hope all citizens. And of course, some societies have not always included everybody living in the society as a citizen. But we will find these values of necessities of life and rights of life in constitutions of countries, and we find a global sense of that in the UN Declaration of Rights. And so the UN Declaration of Human Rights is an interesting document for us to read and see how it should apply. For example, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you find a necessity of life of equal access to education. Without education, you are handicapped as a citizen. Without education, your access to jobs can be limited. Your access to earning a living can be limited. And to illustrate that, let me take a very notorious example in Canada. In the late 1880s, the Canadian government, with the support of the population, the citizens, the voting citizens, created religious residential schools and took Indigenous children from their families. The idea was basically to take the culture away from these Indigenous children and retrain them as the model of the time of a good Canadian system. And of course, we've changed the model now. The system at the time, taking indigenous children from their families and putting them in residential schools, residential meaning they had to live in the school, they were separated from their families as a way of separating them from the influence of their families and the influence of the culture. This indigenous children, their culture, their indigenous language were taken away from them, and they were retrained in this model of the time of a citizen. And in part of this retraining, the system limited the education of indigenous children to the level of grade 3 or grade 6. Over time, over 100 years of indigenous residential schools, the grade level may have increased, but it was still at a fairly low level, a limitation. And that limitation in education of indigenous students in residential schools means that they would be limited in jobs for the rest of their life. In addition, the curriculum in these residential schools was farm labor for the boys and domestic skills for the girls, so that the girls could be the wives of farm laborers. And basically, it's hard not to avoid reaching the conclusion that the system was designed to turn indigenous people into serfs. That was not an accident. Curriculum is not an accident. And oddly enough, the system also ingrained in the students a sense of gratitude for the education they were given, gratitude for an education which restricted them and caused them hardship. So if you listen to some elderly indigenous people, they will talk about this this dilemma and conflict in their feelings about residential schools. Now, if you accept the idea of a social contract, then the harm done to indigenous people in Canada in residential schools creates an ethical debt to be repaid. And so as you go through the outline in this course and the options for the story assignment, you'll see that one of the options I've given you in this course is an assignment about the legal and ethical issue of unceded indigenous land. That's an option for you. That is, this university is built on indigenous land that was never legally transferred. And so that's a really interesting issue, and an issue that that has news values and should concern it. So back to education. Education is a necessity for a healthy society, and it's publicly funded for everybody, no matter how much money a family has, right now up to the level of high school. And the idea is that through the education system, publicly funded education system, you create a more productive, healthy, happy workforce through better education. Educated voters can make better decisions. Education benefits society as a whole, and so for that reason we justify taxpayers paying for the education system, paying for universities, even if the whole population doesn't attend university. And yes, if you're thinking, I'd agree with you that that argument then would be an argument to make university tuition free. I know students are very conscious of tuition fees. International students are very conscious of tuition fees. What sometimes students don't recognize is that if you're a Canadian student, most of your tuition is actually paid by taxpayers, And so at Thompson Rivers University, if you're a Canadian student, you're typically paying about 30% of the cost of your university education through your tuition. The other 70% is paid by taxpayers, Canadian taxpayers, who may never go to university. If you're an international student, your tuition is higher than a Canadian student because the government doesn't feel there's support to for taxpayers in Canada to support the tuition of international students. But as we move into a stronger sense of a global society, that may be something we want to rethink. So I said that equality, justice, and fairness can sometimes transcend impact, magnitude, and proximity. Justice can be a higher factor for the good of society, regardless of proximity. And this is where Marie Colvin is supreme. Marie Colvin does not appeal to the news values of proximity or familiarity. Marie Colvin reports from countries distant from readers of the Sunday Times in Britain. She reports from cultures that are strange to readers from Britain. Colvin reports from Chechnya, from Sri Lanka, from East Timor, from Syria. No proximity there. She appeals to a deep sense of humanity in her readers, regardless of distance, culture, and familiarity. She appeals to the organization of humanity to do what is good for humanity, instead of nation against nation, or local interest against local interest, or America first, or whatever. Marie Colvin appeals to a deep sense of humanity. That's the essence of her stories. She appeals to what is healthy for humanity, and she tries, through stories, she tries to kindle a sense of humanity in her readers by telling them personal stories of people caught in conflict that they don't deserve. So Marie Colvin, and you can see this when you're reading her biography, Marie Colvin helps define ethical, responsible humanity through ethical, responsible journalism. If you don't react to a story by Marie Colvin, it could be asked, what kind of human being are you? And that is why Marie Colvin's news values matter. That's why Marie Colvin feels she has a mission in journalism that she can't live without. Journalism fulfills Marie Colvin as a human being because of the importance of the news values she focuses on journalism. So some journalists, like Martha Gellhorn, who inspired Marie Colvin, get worn down and cynical over the length of their career. And I posted on Moodle for you a piece from Martha Gellhorn, where Gellhorn writes about her sense of disillusionment. Gellhorn, in her life, from an earlier generation than Marie Colvin, Gellhorn sees the same atrocities committed year after year, and seeing the repetition of these atrocities, it affects her idealism about humanity and about journalism. And if you dig into the biography of Martha Gellhorn, you'll see that her sense of humanity and mission is inspired by her mother and her grandmother, who worked to alleviate the poor in society and give more equality to women. And it would be sad, in a sense, if Martha Gellhorn could not take any inspiration from her mother and grandmother, but it's there. It's it's in the DNA in which she was raised. But Martha Gellhorn always had a cynical edge to her, and to some extent, that cynical edge helped her question in reporting what authorities wanted her to believe. So there is some disillusionment in Martha Gellhorn, but there's an early cynicism, and yet there's also a perseverance in Martha Gellhorn as well, despite the disillusionment. Marie Colvin, she doesn't have seem to have the same kind of cynicism that Gellhorn has, and sometimes comes with life. But the Colvin you see in the biography is not a perfect person. She makes mistakes in her life. She's pain and regret, but she still rises above her personal limitations in her journalism. Now, I've already explained in an earlier session that the biography of Marie Colvin gives us a picture of intersecting lives. The focus is mainly on Colvin, but we see her life intersecting with other journalists. One of those is John Swain, who's a colleague of Marie Colvin's on the Sunday Times, and is basically of an earlier generation than Colvin, and his journalism is an early generation. And Swain wrote a marvelous memoir called A River in Time that shows his humanity. I put some short excerpts from John Swain's A River of Time for you on Moodle. And I mention this because I've been talking about the humanity of Marie Colvin, and I also want to mention the humanity of John Swain as an individual and as a journalist. And if you read Swain's marvelous memoir, you'll see a journalist who comes to care for the people of Vietnam and Cambodia, reporting on the wars in Indochina. But he comes to care for these people as though they are his own family, not foreigners, but kindred folk. And he feels pain for what he sees as a journalist in Vietnam and Cambodia during his reporting, and also, not a perfect person, he feels regret for the choices, some of the choices he made in his life as a journalist. He's a human being, but he's feeling damaged and flawed, and that's what makes his memoir quite an experience to read. There's a whole life there in the intersection of John Swain with Marie Colvin that is not explored in the biography, for obvious reasons, that it's a biography of Marie Colvin, one journalist in a sea of journalism, a sea of journalists. But in a journalism textbook, conventional journalism textbook, that is a side of journalism that you don't see. So let me finish this session here. I hope that from what I've just said, that you feel we've gone full circle from news values as simple abstract criteria to the complexities of journalism inside these news values, and to the diverse sea of journalism and journalists.